We now turn our attention to the pipeline itself in ASP.NET and what happens after IIS hands off the request to ASP.NET. So there are quite a few classes involved in this picture. The first thing to know about how ASP.NET manages the request dispatching is each application in IIS that hosts ASP.NET content is going to have a dedicated application domain associated with it within the worker process. And app domains are a .NET construct that give you process-like isolation, although not quite as robust and strong as process isolation, but they give you type localization. Assemblies are always loaded relative to an app domain. And the basic idea is within your .NET code in an app domain, anything you do really should not have effects on other app domains that might be loaded into the same process. So this is the mechanism that ASP.NET uses to create isolation between applications that are hosted inside of the same process. Now in iOS 6 and 7, you can always actually create a separate process to host your application. So you have that option by setting up an application pool into which only your application is mapped. But do keep in mind that if you do map multiple applications to a single worker process, you still do have an amount of isolation provided by the app domain construct. Okay, so the request comes in. It gets dispatched via a class called the HTTP runtime. That's sort of an internal class you probably won't ever end up touching. But the runtime is going to prepare an instance of a class called HTTP worker request, which happens to implement this HTTP map path interface. And this will have all the details necessary to about the request to continue processing it. So the idea is it creates this lower level object that contains all the information needed to process the worker request, and begins handing it down the pipeline. Now, one of the things that's going to happen in addition to the worker request being constructed is this class called the HTTP context. And this is the first one we're encountering that you will actually end up using quite a bit. The HTTP context class is constructed. You have a brand new instance of this guy constructed for each distinct request that comes into your application. And the context is going to have references to all the relevant pieces of information you might need to know about the request. For example, you have access to the request object, HTTP request, the response, the session state, the application state, among other things. So anytime you're looking for context or request relative information, you typically are going to be reaching for the HTTP context object. Now, let's follow the path of the request at this point. Once those two things have been constructed, the runtime is going to dispatch the request onto the application. But as with the handler endpoints, the application class goes through a factory class as well to instantiate it. So there's an HTTP application factory, and that becomes important later, as we'll see, because you may end up needing to intercept that so that you create different application types. So the applications factory is going to construct an instance of the application class, which by default is HTTP application. So that's the standard class in ASP.NET that represents an application. And there is sort of conceptually one of these guys per application, although in practice you actually end up getting multiple instances. But for the conceptual, the way you want to think about it is this is your global object. Anyway, this guy implements an interface called iHTTP async handler, which is actually the base interface for iHTTP handler, and that has a method called begin process request, which this runtime is going to dispatch the request onto. So it's basically going to go to the application and say, okay, here's the request, let's start processing it. And the application class is going to continue execution on that thread and locate the appropriate handler factory associated with the endpoint request coming in. So it's going to look at the extension like ASPX or ASHX and say, okay, I need to go find the factory that's capable of processing that type of request. And the handler factory, if it's a page, for example, will end up just dispatching onto a page endpoint, as we saw earlier. which implements iHTTP handler. But this is a very general mechanism, so it doesn't have to be a page. This can actually just be anything that implements the iHTTP handler interface. And we'll talk about how you might build alternative endpoints that implement that interface directly. Now, one other piece of information that's useful to know is hanging off of the application here are a series of modules. So these are modules that can intercept various events that happen in the application, and they all implement the iHTTP module interface, and they can do whatever is useful at sort of intercepting and processing or manipulating the request. So, for example, things that are implemented in modules typically include security. Authentication is a module level feature. Authorization would be a module level feature. Things that you want to have happen outside of the actual processing of the request and have happen across all requests coming into the application. These are things that you might want to implement in terms of a module. Okay, so in the end, there are 3 extensibility points here that you typically will end up using. The most common one that you'll end up using is, in fact, the application class. And we'll start with that next. The application class, you write in ASP.NET by creating a global.asax file and building a class that derives from HTTP application. And you can then override events, you can intercept requests, etc. The second point of extensibility are the modules. So you can build your own HTTP modules here and attach them to the application class. The functionality in a module is actually very similar to the functionality that you might build into an application, and we'll talk about the difference between these two. When might you want to prefer one over the other? But that's extensibility point number 2. And then number 3 is right here, the actual HTTP handler class. You can write your own HTTP handlers. Let me redraw that. Your own HTTP handlers and have them process their own custom extensions to do something interesting. Okay? So build applications, build modules, or build handlers. Those are the options you have for extending the pipeline.